Yes, I'm here at the E2E conference in London, and I met one of my heroes, I would say, my Hyper-V heroes. But maybe you introduce yourself. Who are you and what are you doing?
I am Aidan Finn, otherwise known as Joe Elway. In some places, don't ask, long story. And the video's only so long. I tweet on www.aidanfinn.com. I'm a Microsoft MVP with the virtual machine expertise. And I'm known for Hyper-V, System Center, Windows stuff. Done a little blogging, writing, speaking on those topics over the last few years.
The little blogging is a quite understatement, isn't it?
A little bit.
Aidan, today you had two sessions. One session was about Hyper-V in Windows 8, but we will not cover that, it's too long. The other one was Hyper-V and backup and CSV.
Yep.
I want to talk about that because it's a very important thing to do it right. What can you tell our viewers about it?
Okay, I suppose Spider-Man was right. With great power comes great responsibility. Cluster shared volume and the way you can back up virtual machines is very powerful, but it's also complex. And you have to understand the relationship between how you back up virtual machines at the storage layer. So you can grab an entire virtual machine or a collection of virtual machines and back them up as basically symbol files, like as if they were Word documents. Yeah. But there are things happening under the hood with cluster shared volume and with your storage network and your private networks in your Hyper-V cluster that can impact performance. And when you start to get more complex environments like a multi-site cluster or a geo cluster or a campus cluster, you can start to have really big problems. And there's also some scaling problems if you don't have a proper design process. I think one of the problems we've had with cluster shared volume is we haven't been given a process. Yeah. So a few of us have thrown around ideas over the last few years, and then a few months ago I decided to write a white paper and try to accumulate some of those ideas, and got some help from other people who contribute to the community, such as Hans Riedewert and Didier Van Hoy. Sorry Didier for mispronouncing that badly.
He will excuse it.
Hopefully. I'll find out in a few minutes. So yeah, we tried to come up with a process and tune it, and that's what I tried to do today in the presentation. So it was a short enough time slot, but it gave me an opportunity to make people aware, because I think most people haven't been aware that you just can't treat it as a simple dumb volume and just back up virtual machines that are stored just anywhere. You need to have a process that initially takes your backup policy into view and place virtual machines in cluster shared volumes that are related by a backup policy. So if I back up virtual machines at 11 p.m, they'll be in cluster shared volume 1. If I back up virtual machines at 12 p.m, or 12 a.m, sorry, they'll be in cluster shared volume 2. And then we start thinking about things like fault-tolerant VMs. So if I create a SQL cluster using a pair of virtual machines, I'll want them in different cluster shared volumes, just in case a SAN administrator deletes one of the volumes. And then you want to start considering things like replication policies. So some SANs will allow you to say, I want to replicate virtual disk 1 to another site, but I don't want to do another virtual disk. And you can say some virtual machines should be replicated and some shouldn't. So then we start putting virtual machines into LUNs that will be replicated and virtual machines that won't be replicated. Then we have other things we need to consider, such as SCSI-3 reservations. That's another conversation piece. That's a complicated one that people only discover when things go wrong, and the hardware vendors don't necessarily help us too much with that one. And then we have a good one which Didier brought up, which is the size of the cluster shared volume. You get to a point where we could create 20 terabyte cluster shared volumes and put loads of virtual machines into those, but right now in Windows 2008 or 2, if I want to do an offline check disk with that could take a weekend, could take a week to do that check disk, and that would mean all those virtual machines would be offline for that time. So we have to start considering how big we make our cluster shared volume for those offline operations. And as I said, the SCSI-3 or the SCSI-3 reservation issue is a big one.
Before you go too deep in the subject.
Yeah.
These are very important things you talk about, but first, many of my viewers or our viewers are not MVPs and know the stuff. What is the real problem with backup and cluster shared volumes? There is something, a mode in
I/O. Yeah.
So maybe we talk a little bit about that, because
Sure.
I think many people are not aware of that.
Sure. So redirected I/O, I sometimes make it sound like a big bad demon. It does have a good feature. So we'll talk about the good feature first.
Okay.
Which is when a host loses, so we have a cluster of Hyper-V hosts working together. So we get live migration and high availability for the virtual machines. And if one of them loses connectivity to the SAN, where our virtual machines are stored,
Yeah.
if we didn't have redirected I/O, then the virtual machines would just stop working. The idea here is the I/O between the hosts and the SAN gets redirected from the SAN network via one of the private networks in the cluster. I call it the CSV network. Some people call it the cluster communications network. Sometimes we actually have two of those, so we
Yeah.
have both. And that's the good piece of redirected I/O. So the I/O is no longer direct to the SAN, it's redirected through the owner of the CSV volume, called a CSV coordinator.
Yeah.
Now that CSV coordinator, it's an automatic role that's created when you create a CSV, and it has the responsibility for that volume and for doing low-level operations in that CSV volume. And some of those low-level operations include things like expanding dynamic VHDs or performing VSS snapshots. And that's where the backup story comes into play with redirected I/O. And this is where the bad stuff comes in. So when we back up a CSV volume, we're actually performing a VSS snapshot of the volume. We're also, that quiesces the volume, quiesces the virtual machines, and quiesces the services in the virtual machines. It's a quick process, nothing notices. However, it requires exclusive access to the volume, which means a CSV coordinator has to force redirected I/O to happen. So all of the hosts that are performing I/O to that CSV that is being backed up have to redirect their I/O through the CSV network to the CSV coordinator. So we have maybe a 1 gigabit per second network doing the I/O for all of these hosts in the cluster. Now, if we design things correctly, that won't matter much. It'll be a very short time frame. However, if we don't take care, that could be a very long time frame.
You have an example for the time frame in your presentation
Yeah.
from a customer?
I mentioned one, I'm not going to name who it was, obviously, but they were in a situation where there was a lot of complicating factors, and they were in redirected I/O mode for 40 minutes of every hour. Yeah.
Quite a long time. They have only 20 minutes left for non-redirected.
Yeah, and that shouldn't be the case. So when we're doing storage level backup, unfortunately, some of the marking material would have us believe that we should do that every 15 minutes or every hour. Realistically, I would say that type of backup we should only do as often as the VM's configuration changes. So how often does the operating system change? How often do the services change?
Not much.
No, once a week, maybe once a month, maybe twice a month. We should do that type of backup for the VMs. What it really we care about is the data.
Yeah.
We can have a backup agent in the virtual machine, and that doesn't have any impact on the storage, no redirected I/O. And we can do that backup once every 15 minutes or once every hour, on a more frequent basis. So we actually do two types of backup. The backup of the VM at the storage level, once a week, once a month. And then we have the backup of the data, which we can do very frequently because we're only taking the data and it's really only the changes to the data if we use a good backup solution like a DPM. And that gives us a very nice backup solution which minimizes redirected I/O. And choosing a storage solution that has a hardware VSS provider, so something like the MSAs, the HP left hands, the EVAs, all have hardware VSS providers, and that limits as well the amount of time that's required for the redirected I/O by performing a SAN level snapshot instead of an NTFS level snapshot. And redirected I/O mode with the hardware VSS provider only lasts the length of time to take the snapshot.
This is rather fast.
Very fast. So a SAN administrator who's snapshotting a LUN or a VDisk in their SAN will know how fast that is. You know, it's a few minutes maybe for a big volume. Whereas if you're using the system or the Windows VSS provider in something like a software iSCSI solution, You're in redirected I/O mode from the time the VSS snapshot starts until the backup ends, and that's a very long time. It could be 40 minutes of every hour.
Okay, you have written a great white paper about that. Where can we find it?
So that's on aidanfinn.com, AIDANFINN.com, and on the white papers page you'll find a CSV and backup white paper, and it explains how CSVs work and how redirected I/O works, and explains all the complicating factors, and even goes into some of the advanced things like multi-site clusters and how you could have lots of things happening at once. And I've also given a process to help people figure out how to best design the CSVs and how to place their virtual machines to get the optimal backup solution.
Okay, another question I have. I said in the beginning of the video we don't want to talk about the next version, but especially in this case, what will the next version bring us in the concept of backup?
The big story is redirected I/O goes away in backup, and there was a big cheer when that was announced at Build. That's really, really good news. And we also, on the CSV side of things, I mentioned earlier how we wanted to limit the size of the volume so we could do offline check disks and things like that. In Windows 8 we're getting an online repair. So what happens is I/O gets paused briefly between the host and the storage, and that allows the volume to get repaired, or as repaired as possible. Then I/O is resumed before the virtual machines notice, so there's no data loss. And if the repair hasn't completed, it will repeat the process until the repair is completed. So we get this lovely patching solution of the file system that may slow down I/O for a couple of seconds, but it has no great impact, which means we can have these bigger cluster shared volumes. We're not using as many SCSI 3 reservations as we would be otherwise. And we get a nice, great solution for backup with direct I/O.
Okay, Aidan, thank you very much that you take the time to do this interview, and I'm looking forward to meet you again and do another interview.
Cool, look forward to it. Thanks, Carsten.